So today I'll be explaining to you how to design an ER diagram. So we are going to do the crow feet notation. So ER meaning entity relationship diagram. So I'm going to show you simply how to design the ER diagram. First we have to understand the notation. To design an ER diagram, first we have to have entities which are represented by a rectangle. For example, if I have a library will have many books. So book will become an entity. So then we have to write book in a rectangle because rectangle represents entity. An entity will have representation of places, employees will be employee, different employee we have. So it's we can write employee in the rectangle, events, people, etc., which are represented in a rectangle. These are called entities. In other words, entities represent the tables of your database. Now, cardinality constraints, it's what? Cardinality constraint, we have many. We are using here the crow feet notation. So we have mandatory many, mandatory one, optional many, optional one. We have to understand what is mandatory many. Let us say here I have book, an entity book. So a student hires or rents several books. Or a student hires at least one book. So this means the student can hire one book, two books, three books, etc. So then we apply mandatory many. Starts with one, then here many. Crow feet. So this is mandatory many. So when we know that this entity will occur at least once and many times. Mandatory one. This happens exactly one. If in your question it's written exactly one student, exactly one. So we have mandatory one which applies. And here we're going to write student in the entity. Optional many. So as the words say optional, so we have an O which is here represented. Then many, it's the crow feet. Optional many. So optional many means it may occur or it may not occur, which means that this entity may happen. And since we have this crow feet here, it may happen many times. So when we have the word may or can, we know that it has to have this one, the O in front, when we have may or can. So optional, optional many. Optional one, this even happens only once. So you just cut it with a one, optional one. So these are the four cardinality constraints, and it is how it is represented under the crow feet notation. A staff may make several bookings. So let's see this scenario. Here we know that we have staff. In an organization, there will be many staff. We are not going to have only one staff working for a company. We're going to have many records of staff, many staff details to store. So we know that staff will be a table in a company. So staff will be a table, therefore it's represented in this rectangle because the rectangle is an entity. May make several bookings. So here we have booking. Now, may make several bookings. May make several bookings. A staff may make several bookings. May, optional. Many for the several, because several stands many bookings. But booking must be effected by exactly one staff. A booking Must be done by only one staff. So it is a mandatory one. This is the condition box, but links staff with booking. So we write a verb here, makes. Why a verb makes here? Because this has to be singular, this has to be singular. I've written bookings here, but in the entity, I didn't put the S. I've omitted the S because my entity must have only singular verb in it. So staff makes, may make many booking. Each staff may make many booking. It is how it is read. Each booking is made by exactly one staff. Another scenario, an equipment must have at least one supplier. So we are seeing a shop, we're going to have many equipments. So equipment will enter a table, will be an entity represented by a rectangle. An equipment must have at least one supplier. At least one. At least means it can be one, it can be two, it can be three, it can be more than that. So that's why an equipment must have, has one or more supplier, represented by the mandatory many. A supplier may supply many equipments. A supplier may supply many equipment. May supply optional many. Again, it has to be singular in the entity. The equipment is identified by EQID. Is identified by, this means each equipment will have a different EQID. What do we understand by this? It is a primary key. So EQID here is an attribute to start with. So attribute is represented in an ellipse. In the ER diagram, attributes, that is field names, they are represented into an ellipse. And EQID being an attribute and being a primary key, it has to have a full underline. If EQID was a foreign key, then the underline would have been a dotted underline. But in our case, it is a primary key, so it has a full underline under it. And has a name, that's another attribute. The normal attributes won't be underlined. It will be represented in an ellipse. Supplier. A supplier will have a primary key. Supplier ID is a primary key. Supplier ID. And it is a primary key, that's why it's underlined. Full underline. And other attributes, S name, we could have, I haven't put it here, we can have S name, another attribute here. Address, which consists of add1 state zip. Address. What do you understand by this? In my table supplier, I have 3 columns, 3 fields, add1, state, and zip. All 3 together indicate the address of that supplier. So in an ER diagram, we represent it this way. We say address, which is represented by add1 state zip in my table. So this is a representation of a composite attribute. It means that these 3 together represent the address of that supplier. So now we have another scenario. A hospital has 2 types of patient, outpatient and resident patient. So an outpatient and resident patient. This means when we have 2 types here, this means supertype and subtype relationships. So patient in the entity, we have 2 types, outpatient and resident patient. So this indicates subtype to patient. We need to have this circle so that the subtype and supertype can join to each other. Now, when we're indicating supertype, subtype, you have a circle, we need to have the arc here. that cuts the line. In a hospital, we can have either resident patient or outpatient. We cannot have both types of patient at the same time, of course. So for this reason, I have outpatient, resident patient. These are the only subtypes that can exist at a time for a patient. So that's why we have a double line here. This double line indicates total specialization rule. If there would have been other subtype, then only a single line would have appeared here. A patient. Now, each resident patient may be assigned one bed. May be assigned. It's an optional one. When we have the word may, we know it's an O here that cuts the line. One is the maximum type. We can give a resident patient a bed. So optional one. And a bed assigned is assigned to exactly one patient, one resident patient, exactly one, mandatory one. All patients are administered by exactly one, all patient, whether it's outpatient or resident patient. That's why here, administers, responsible physician administers at least one patient, one or more. So that's why we have this mandatory mean applied to the patient. A patient is administered by exactly one, mandatory one, responsible physician. So thank you very much for your attention. So that's it for today. Hope you've understood ER diagram.